Hello, everybody. I'm Silvahara Petian. Welcome to another edition of the Silvahara Petian Show. Today, we have a very important guest, and we're going to be talking about a very important topic. It is absolutely necessary for us to stay informed, to stay engaged, and to participate in what is happening in our communities, no matter who it's happening to. And 2020, 2021 has obviously been very significant in having these conversations. Many of us have witnessed this in our own communities and among our friends. There has been a rise in the number of reports of violence against Asian Americans across the country. In Georgia, we saw a man allegedly shooting and killing 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian Americans. We have seen physical violence from coast to coast, from New York all the way to San Francisco. Obviously, this is not new. It is horrifying to the community, but obviously not surprising. But what is surprising is the information we're going to be talking about today. And that is the fact that many of these crimes, although potentially sparked by racism, sparked by race, are not being charged as hate crimes. And this is the conversation we're going to have. We're going to learn a little bit about what's going on. We're going to learn a little bit about what we can do, and also why it's important to focus on what needs to change moving forward. Joining us today is the CEO of Asian Hall of Fame, Maki Hsieh, and the CEO of the Robert Chin Foundation. Thank you so much for making time for us and joining us to educate us, inform us, and tell us how we as a community can participate and stay engaged to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Silva. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a really important topic because whatever we do in terms of finding solutions for the Asian community is going to affect everyone else. It's going to affect Armenians and Jewish and other vulnerable groups in this country and around the world. So I think this is a really, really good conversation and a critical one to have at this time.
You know, for our listeners and viewers who are not as informed, who do not spend an incredible amount of time watching the news or reading the news as many of us do, who may be coming into this conversation wondering what is really going on, can you talk to us a little bit about, this is obviously not new. Asian Americans have been targeted for many, many years, but we've seen a spike, we've seen a rise, and not only the rise of the physical crime, but also the blatant nature of some of the crimes that we see. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So, but I think you said exactly right, that the blatant nature, the frequency, the brutality has increased, the violence has increased. Yes, this has always happened. It's not just because of political rhetoric. It's not just because of phrases that have been flung here and there in the media and in politics for the last few years. This has been going on for many decades. We can trace it all the way back even to Islamophobia during 9/11, trace it back to the LA riots, we still remember very well. We can trace it all the way back to even the Vietnam War, Korean War, then go all the way back to World War II, where Japanese were forcibly incarcerated, and then you also have Filipinos fight under the American flag and still waiting for their benefits, and we go all the way back, to the beginning of all this, which is in the 1800s during the gold rush and the sugar plantation building of that in Hawaii, during the building of the railroad in California, where labor was forced, and folks came over here from another country to help build our economy, and they were brutalized. They were given little tools to make something very, very difficult, like a railroad, and they were ridiculed and humiliated and many times murdered. But this was all okay. It was all seen as, hey, it's just part of what it means to be an Asian American. This is the Asian American experience. And it was really justified because, and a lot of people don't know this, it was justified because in 1511, Portugal colonized Malaysia. That was the first colonial port. One by one, each Asian country fell to a colonial power. A lot of people don't know that there are only 4 Asian countries that have never been colonized. One of them is Japan, who became a colonizer so that it wouldn't become colonized. So if you take a look at all of this violence, all of this oppression, now leading up to what's going on right now. What's going on right now is you've had this violence against Asians, harassment, assaults, theft, beatings, but they've been able to hide behind lesser offenses. For example, if you shout that you, oh, go back home and you're really mean to somebody and then you beat them, you can actually hide behind an assault, which is a lesser charge. In fact, 18 states don't even track hate crimes. 3 don't even have hate crime statutes in their laws. There was a situation that happened just a week ago in Maine where there was a mother and her daughter in a gas station. The doors were closed. This guy came up, started screaming at them, saying, "Chink, go home, and this you caused corona." They're Cambodian, they're not Chinese. So when the media heard about it, they picked up the story. The Maine Attorney General then came out and said, "This is terrible. We don't have hate crime statutes in our laws, but I declare this is a civil rights offense." But what did that guy get? A $2,000 fine. So what does that happen? He can pay the fine, they go out and commit the crime again. The point is, you can do all the reporting and all the tracking and all of the fundraising that you want, but if you're not able to deter crime and reduce violence, it's going to go nowhere. It's going to keep on escalating. And this is why this conversation is so important right now. We have an escalation of 3,800% of crimes against Asians. 68% of Asian hate crime victims are women. So all this violence against women and against Asians, it has to end. It has to stop.
Yes, and we have seen the systemic impact of such violence, of being targeted, right? We saw it in real life, in our streets in 2020 with the BLM movement, right? Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it's important for us to also understand a little bit about the nuances and the intricacies within the culture and the stereotype, right? Being Armenian, being a person of color, I know that there are nuances within my community, regardless of what we talk about. I think it's important for us to talk about and try to understand exactly, what is going on in your hearts and in your minds. And there is this stereotype among those of us who are not Asian, right, who look from the outside, and it's been depicted in movies and series and in all kinds of arts and media, the quiet, quote unquote, right? The person who sort of turns the other cheek. Talk to me about where that's from. Is that true? Does that happen? Is it about time that we stopped doing that and spoke up? Because it's just not okay. And obviously it has all kinds of historic implications. So educate us a little bit about that.
The American press and the American sociological circles, we call this a model minority myth. And that is something to think about when we're talking about this quest for perfection, always looking like we're okay, nothing is wrong, we can handle our stuff, don't worry. So that is one part of it that I do want to dive into, and you bring up an amazing point, which is, yes, this is actually what is camouflaging a lot of the crimes right now that people are not reporting because of this model minority myth that we want to make sure that we are okay to the outside world. But the reason why this exists is not just because it's an American thing or Asian American Pacific Islander culture. It's also because from the roots of colonialism, you had a power in your country who had the power to kill you and your family and your village if you did not comply. So this whole culture of silence, and even though Asians are 60% of the world, they've become the silent majority by force, because if they were not silent and turned the other way, and if they just reported it, they would actually be killed. They would actually have some consequences against their family. So now when we're taking a look at right now the model minority myth, what this does is it does a couple of things so well. The first thing it does is that it really blurs the distinctions between the Asians. Asians are not just Asian. I mean, there are a lot of different languages, cultures, food, customs. There's just a lot of, even religions are different within the Asian community. And there are also different kinds of Asian regions. There's Central Asia, which Asian Hall of Fame has just accepted that. That's Kazakhstan. There's a lot of the stans. There's Southeast Asia, which includes India. And then there's West Asia. Most of it is Arabic. 8 of them should be considered part of Asian Hall of Fame and what we recognize for excellence. So here's the thing is you have a lot of diversity, and no one is championing the diversity. Everyone's saying, okay, you are one group and we're just going to target all of you. And because all of you should be perfect, so you're not going to care if we target you. Yeah, the second thing is that the model minority myth pits Asians against other races, other groups, because suddenly everyone's saying, wait a minute, Asians are doing just fine. They're either doctors or married to doctors. Shouldn't you guys be doing fine? Why don't you look at them? Oh, Jewish are the same too. They're either doctors or married to doctors. Armenians, oh, they're either millionaires or married to millionaires. Everybody should be fine. Nobody needs any assistance. Nobody needs any funding. Everybody should be fine. And why should we talk about you if you're fine? This is a key. That which leads me to the third point. It's that because of the model minority myth, you have competition within the Asian group, you have competition with Asians and others, and then you have competition within people in their families, in their communities. There's suddenly this rush for the college admissions or for that job that your husband is fighting against someone else because they're not more perfect than you. So it's really competitive, and it really creates and breeds this culture of silence. It breeds this culture of inequity, and it breeds this culture of distrust. The other thing that model minority myth perpetuates is that, oh, Asians are sneaky, or they're going to be deceptive because they need this thing, that the limited resource, that they're going to go after it. So there's a lot of depictions in media of the deceptive, sly, smart, but sneaky Asian. Right. And this is really, really wrong because, we're actually not very, very quiet, and we're very, very nice. And I think that this myth of how we're perfect and we're going to turn the other way if you're going to beat us is really perpetuating a lot of the violence today.
Yeah, and it's really important to talk about this this behavior, this thing that has been within our cultures that perpetuates silence, right? So if you don't say anything and if you don't rock the boat, then you are the model citizen. If you don't say anything, if you don't rock the boat, then you are going to get the promotion. If you don't say anything, you don't rock the boat, then you are going to be treated right. And feeling like, and this isn't just the Asian American community, but just as minorities and immigrants, right? Feeling like you have to, feeling like you are made. It's not our feeling. We are made to feel like we do not belong, right? Yeah. So the society and the structure and the system makes the communities and the people who are not American feel like we don't belong. So then we spend the rest of our lives trying to prove that we do belong. Even those that have been born here, have served for our country, and have been American for generations, still it is in our DNA, it is in the culture, it is in our way of life of trying to consistently prove that we are worthy of the title of being American. And part of that is making sure that we don't rock the boat. That's and we don't speak up, and that we don't challenge the powers that be. And that's been, I guess, okay, and has served its purpose to a certain degree. But now I think we are all witnessing a time, we are witnessing the collision of what happens when power goes into the space of abuse, and submission, right, goes into the space of toxicity. Yeah. So you have abusive power and toxic submission, and now we have created a situation where people are actually getting hurt. And
but you said that so succinctly. The power paradigm propels violence, and if the power paradigm is such that inequity is perpetuated and equality and access to equal opportunities is denied, you're going to have continued violence. It's not going to go away. You see that in Myanmar. You see that all around the world. Mm-hmm. And the way that Asians are being targeted right now in America is not just in America, because Asians are everywhere. They're majority of the world. You have 2 million living in Canada. Canadian media already reported that hate crimes against Asians 6 months ago surpassed all hate crimes in the United States. This was before the media in America even picked up on the story. There are 2 million Asians living in Germany, a lot of violence there. 2 million Asians living in France, 2 million living in Italy. 4.2 million Asians live in England. A lot of racism and violence there. Sao Paulo has 2 million Japanese living there. They're a little bit more peaceful because they're more integrated. So then when you're taking a look at some of these other countries that have a very strong Asian population and how one is being targeted, but one is being celebrated, we have a lot to learn.
Yeah, we do. And the importance of this is one impacts the other, right? So if the silence breeds the systemic inequity and inequality, and the systemic inequality and inequity fails to hold those who are in the wrong and are abusing either the system or just are blatantly committing crimes because of race, does not hold those accountable properly, which then perpetuates the consistent nature of how this actually works. This is why I wanted to go back to silence, because essentially the silence and the lack of consequences and accountability is what breeds what we've seen. And it's been happening in the Black community, it's been happening in the Armenian community, it's been happening in communities of color now, in the Asian community, and we are seeing the rise of it. And now, when you see a 75-year-old grandmother, defending her life in San Francisco against someone twice her size who's coming for her, then you're shocked. How could this happen? That's not, the visuals of that is not something that fits in our paradigm. But the reality is, enough is enough, right?
Enough is enough. And also there was a situation in New York where, a woman was beaten in the ground and everybody just stood in shock, not knowing what to do. One store owner even closed his stores. I think he was let go for that being captured on video, for just closing his doors and say, hey, I don't want to help this lady. And the silence is really prevalent. The silence is driving ignorance. And as you know, racism and hate, the root of all this is ignorance. So if, for example, you are a sixth grader going to school in the California system, like my child is, and then you come home and you say, well, we learned about the gold rush, of course. We didn't learn that the Chinese labored in it. We learned about World War II. Of course, we didn't hear about the Holocaust or about the Japanese incarceration. So then if you're encountering this K through 12, and you're encountering this in the workforce, you're encountering this in the judicial system with law enforcement, guess what? Because there's no narratives embedded and integrated, you're going to stay silent, because it wouldn't benefit you to say anything? Because the system itself is silent, so you're going to stay silent. And I think now you're seeing in the last 3 months, the silence is now broken. People are all ready to talk, and people are ready to say enough is enough.
Yeah. I want to continue talking about this, but before we continue this, I want to ask you, how are you? How are you holding up?
You know what? It's been really difficult, because I feel for the seniors. I feel for the seniors, and I know that they're looking at this in total shock and disbelief, because they have lived through a lot. They've lived through wars, they've lived through recession. They lived through also their own harassment and assaults. And I look at my mother, and she's in total shock. She doesn't know what to think. Actually, she was convinced that I was killed. There was a hate crime victim in my town. I live near Arcadia, and she saw that, and she thought it was me. She thought I was actually killed. She lives in Taiwan, so she was hysterical. And I think you're seeing how what's happening in America is also affecting what's going on overseas, and it makes me feel even more passionate about standing up and making a difference, for our seniors and for our children. So for me, it makes me sad, it makes me upset, but it also drives a new purpose for me to stand up and speak up.
I want to talk a little bit about what is the organization doing, and how can we help you in moving forward, and how can we stay engaged, how can we stay informed, how can we participate in what's going on?
Those are very important big questions, because now you're talking about allies, that important word, what we didn't have before. Before, everyone was siloed in their own movement. Everyone was siloed in their own passions. We really didn't think that we were connected in any way, in our mutual suffering, in our mutual consciousness. And I think this whole idea that you put forth, which is that we have a lot in common. Silence is one. Violence against us out of the blue is another. It's not deserved, it's not warranted. We shouldn't experience that in this country. The third one is, now we should really reach out and have allies and really engage with each other. I think that there are a lot of places where a lot of our cultures intersect, where the Asian culture, Black culture, Latinx, Hispanic, Armenian, LGBTQ, they intersect in many ways, but we don't reach out and we don't talk about it. Ways to become engaged are, if you go to church, if you're dropping off your daughter at school, get involved in the PTA, get involved in the church, get involved in other churches. So you can actually cross-culture. And I think one of the things that Asian Hall of Fame, our third pillar, is cross-cultural narratives, because we know that purity is not always the only way. Asians tend to look at purity. We don't like Chinese marrying the Japanese, don't like Japanese marrying the Koreans, and this and that. There's a lot of fight for purity, but purity is not the future. The future is integration. For example, Asian Hall of Fame has been talking about building a center, an Asian Hall of Fame center. Actually, Glendale is one of the top places that we're really interested in building our center, and a big exhibit of that would be the Asian Armenian exhibit and all the commerce in the past, and the Asian Persian and the Asian Black, and because there's been a lot of exchange of commerce and culture in the past, it's just never been talked about. So these are the things that we can do every day, to learn about each other, to support each other.
Yeah, and the movement and the fight for making sure that the laws are changed, that the legislation is changed to make sure that when there is a hate crime, it is identified as such, right? I mean, we've seen so many of these incidents, people just being charged with assault or attempted murder, and not being charged as a hate crime. That is an important piece of information that, in order for it to change, in order for it to have some kind of a deeper and stronger consequences, which essentially doesn't just help the Asian American community, it helps any community, any minority community, disenfranchised community across the board, right? Because if the legislation is stronger, then it doesn't matter if the victim is Asian American or Black American or Armenian American or any type of person. If it's fueled by hate, then there needs to be specific consequences. Talk to me a little bit about that. And to have that kind of legislation, we are going to need to be united in many ways.
We're going to have to be united and educated in many ways. For example, there's a difference between penalties and the hate crime law. There are hate crime laws in place. It's been going on since the Civil Rights Act, and it's been expanded. Every president has expanded to protect protected groups. However, the penalties are not severe enough. If the penalty for a hate crime law is you get a $2,000 fine and you can walk out and commit a crime again, that's not severe enough. That doesn't deter crime. And if the penalty is such that it's so loose that you just get 3 days in jail for beating up a lady just because you don't like her race, it's not severe enough. So there are a lot of things that have to be done on the legislative angle, on the federal, state, and local levels to really address this issue. One group that's been really successful, because a lot of us feel helpless that it can never be done, one group that's been successful is the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Remember them, where they were like, listen, if a kid is killed because a drunk driver hits the kid, this is not okay that the driver just walks away. We have to have more severe penalties.
Right.
And what do? They petition, they went to Congress, they increased legislation, they work with law enforcement, and they have now a very complete platform that deters drunk driving. It's a similar kind of program that I think a lot of us need to come together and create in order to deter violence.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about, because you're obviously embedded and rooted within the culture and the community. I want to hear about what's being felt. And I asked this question because obviously I have some Asian friends and I watch their Instagram feed, and the heart-wrenching things that are being posted about how they are feeling about what's going on, the fear they have, like you said, for the elders, the fear they have for their mothers and fathers and family members is real. And talk to me a little bit about living in that state. And the reality of it is that this isn't new, right? So it's kind of a heightened sense of fear at the moment, but this has been an ongoing thing within the community. And talk to me about living with that for decades. And we in the Armenian community call that the transgenerational trauma of living in a life that is rooted in somewhat survival and fear. Can you talk to me a little bit about what's going on?
Fear is a very big driving force in the Asian culture anyway, because the fear of failure is greater than our quest for success. And this is permeated throughout the entire culture in the way that we raise our children, in the way that we push for success. So when you take that fear of failure and transfer it into now fear of violence, in a way, it's integrated into the thought that, we now have escalating violence against us. We must have failed in some way. We must
Oh,
have not been good enough in some way. Like maybe we didn't study hard enough, or maybe we didn't contribute enough. That makes me cry. Because then you're thinking about the seniors, and they feel this. They think maybe we worked so hard, but we didn't do enough, and that's why we're getting beaten up, and we don't deserve it, but we don't know why it's happening to us. One thing that's really great to see is that a lot of people have come forth, and the media is starting to cover it, whereas before the media did not cover it. Social media influencers did not really think it was that important because they thought, oh, Asians are going to take care of themselves and they're going to be okay. And now they know that we're not okay. And then the fear, and I have a little bit teary-eyed right now thinking about the seniors, but they're scared. They don't want to come out of the house. They don't want to go shopping. I even had a couple of people who said that they don't like to wear the traditional clothing, and they just want to stay as low-key as possible because they don't know what's going to happen if they go to the grocery store, gas up their car, something might happen just because they're Asian. So there is a lot of fear. There is a lot of systemic silence, again, going back to that going on, and this fear is just really grappling the community. I mean, if you see the people who are coming out to march, you see hundreds of people, but you're not seeing thousands, you're not seeing hundreds of thousands, and that's because of the fear.
yeah. And just to note, there have been protests across the country about the fact that the charges have not been hate crime charges in some of these violent acts. There have been protests about why the consequences aren't as severe as the crime itself. And I want to go back to what you talked about. It is such an important element that I never even really, the way you just verbalize is very different than the way I've heard it before. And you're right. I think it is heightened in the Asian American community, but I think this is a sort of an ongoing immigrant issue, this fear of failure, right?
Yeah.
And not only in the eyes of your own family and the eyes of the community, but also fear of failure as an American because you feel like you've been given an opportunity, and having an opportunity means you're supposed to succeed. And if you are the victim of violence, then you must have done something wrong, right?
That's right. And you must have not been good enough. You must not have protected yourself. You must not have been prepared. It's your fault.
And this responsibility that we take on as communities of color, as communities of immigrants, that somehow, even though we're the victims, we bear the responsibility of what happens to us, even though it has nothing to do with us, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. And what happens is that you feel responsible for the escalating violence. Even though it's senseless, even though it's based on prejudice and ignorance, you feel responsible that somehow maybe you didn't do enough to curb the violence. That maybe it's a community issue, that you didn't do enough to turn the tide. Maybe if we were more successful, if we had more money, this would not happen. So then turns back into the whole, okay, in order for us to stay silent and to be left alone, we have to be successful.
Yeah.
So it's an endless cycle.
It is an endless cycle. And you got teary-eyed thinking about the seniors, and I'm getting a little bit, to be honest with you, a little bit angry to thinking about the same systemic elements at work, because that same thing, the self-blame as victims, even though I don't like calling ourselves victims because we're minding our own business and doing our own thing, right? The self-inflicted sort of responsibility and taking on this issue transfers into the workplace. So I think about my young nieces having to sort of take that on. It's the unspoken sort of way of doing things within the cultures and the immigrant societies where you're trying to prove yourself and prove your worth, right? Taking that into the workplace, which is where the systemic abuse of power then perpetuates, where we see all kinds of workplace harassment, including sexual harassment. And there's been so much talk about that as well. And we take on the responsibility, even though we are the ones who are on the receiving end of all of this, right? So how do we break that cycle? When do we finally realize we are worthy of just being?
It's a very familiar trauma survivor template. all trauma survivors go through this where they are traumatized and something terrible has happened, but they think it's their fault, that they created it in some way. And a lot of even Holocaust survivors will talk about this, that maybe if they lived their life differently or if they raised their children differently, they wouldn't have suffered the way they did. And there's this trauma survivor template where we absorb that energy of violence and we decide that, oh, it must be our fault somehow. There are a couple of ways to break the cycle. And from what we've seen successfully others have done is to say, wait a minute, this is not happening because I did something wrong. It's happening because systemically there is something wrong. The system is wrong. It's not I'm wrong. The system is wrong. So when we focus the attention away from the individual to the system, there's a little bit of relief there that says, okay, it's not something that I did wrong. It wasn't wrong that I went walking in that park one day. Because you hear that a lot. People will get abused or violated and they'll say, oh, it's your fault. You shouldn't have walked in that park that day. Okay, you know what? There should not be any reason in America to fear walking in the park. Right. Every day if you want to, right? Yeah. So it's not the individual, it's the system. So we take a look at the system and how to solve it. Now, the other thing about the system is education is a very good one. You know, Anti-Defamation League does a lot as one of the major distributors of K through 12 supplemental curriculum to teach children about anti-Semitism, about racism, about systemic racism. The other thing that they do, which we can learn from, is educating law enforcement. They actually educate all of the new recruits to the FBI about the Latinx racism and racism against Armenians. I mean, this is really, really just one of the largest deliverers of curriculum to law enforcement, which we need to adopt for the Asian community. We don't have anything like that in the Asian community, educating law enforcement that this is a hate crime and this is just an assault. And by the way, if you don't have the legislative power to prosecute, you know, then we need to talk. We need to take a look at how to break this trauma, the cycle of trauma. You know, the other one is to really equip people to feel comfortable. And seniors do not trust, they do not feel comfortable. They need to trust somebody who understands their language, their culture. You know, if you're talking to someone who's American, who doesn't speak your language, he doesn't understand the nuances of the culture, you're not going to really help people to break the trauma. And this goes all the way back to the beginning, which is that there is a need now more than ever for enhanced investments in cultural intelligence. We've always talked about emotional intelligence and EQ. We've always talked about human capital intelligence. This is now the decade, I believe, of cultural and community and creative intelligence. It's very important to bring those all together.
What does that look like? What does cultural intelligence look like?
Cultural intelligence means that instead of being really rooted in your perspective and this is the only way and everybody else has to subjugate, cultural intelligence is more almost like an ambassadorship energy. You know, ambassadorship energy of learning about others without having to sacrifice your own personal values and beliefs, but really learning about the world. What COVID has showed all of us, even a town that doesn't have a single Asian in it, COVID has showed all of us we're all connected. Like it or not, we're all connected. What's happening way over in that ocean over there or the ocean over there is going to affect us here in America. So it's time to really look globally and say that cultural intelligence is really key to being an ambassador to others and asking others to be an ambassador to us.
That's great. You know, I don't really like talking about politics on the show, mostly because I really think it's important to focus on the human experience and talk about things that we can actually do and participate and stay active and engage with. But I do have to ask, how much do you think the former administration, their politics and the language, you know, being a communication expert, I pay attention to all of this and study it, you know, deeply. How much do you think that impacted or has impacted the experience for Asian Americans in this country?
You know, I'm going to say that from the perspective of the Asian Hall of Fame and the Robert Chin Foundation, which was founded in 1960 because of the economic racism against Asians, right? So I'm going to speak to it from that perspective because we are also not a political organization. We're not an advocacy activism organization. We're here to celebrate and elevate awareness, right? So this is a really good question for us. On one hand, yes, there's been political rhetoric in the past year, 2 years. It's been very prevalent. It's been very vocal. And what that did was it made violence okay. It said, you know, there's a stamp of approval. It's okay. In the United States, you can go ahead because it's okay. However, on the other hand, This is echoed in 50% of the country. 50% of the country actually believes in this. And guess what? People outside of the country believes in it too. There was a famous video that went viral in Egypt where a Chinese man was taking an Uber in Egypt, and all of the cars passing the Uber said, "Kick him out. He's got coronavirus. Kick him out." So the guy just dumped this Chinese passenger in the middle of the highway, and that went viral. And the Egyptian government had to step in and say, "Wait a minute, this is not okay. You cannot be going around saying that." This rhetoric of coronavirus and the China flu and the Kung flu, this is not okay. Right. So it's not just in the United States that we have this political rhetoric. The political rhetoric made it okay, but it is echoed in 50% of the country, and it is echoed around the world. The political rhetoric is everywhere, and it is our responsibility as community leaders, as parents, as concerned citizens, to step forward and to advance equity and equal treatment when it comes to preventing hate crimes and preventing violence.
Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate it. I want to ask you one more question, and then we're going to wrap this up. Tell me a little bit about the Asian Hall of Fame and the Robert Chin Foundation. It was started in the 1960s. Tell me a little bit about what is your goal, what is your mission, what do you hope to accomplish?
Asian Hall of Fame was established because the founder, Karen Wong, who is the fourth generation of the Robert Chin family, saw that Asians were not being recognized. And she saw that Asians' narratives were not even being integrated. And more importantly, Asian stories were not discussed in the national narrative at all. So she established this. It just started out as a nice idea in a group, became bigger and bigger. We've inducted Bruce Lee, Christy Yamaguchi, Apollo Ono, Connie Chung. And some really amazing people have been inducted just to show solidarity, inclusive unity, that Asian contributions have been undervalued in the national narrative, and people need to know. People need to celebrate excellence, need to celebrate unity.
Thank you again for all of the information and your transparency and your vulnerability and your openness to helping us understand, educate us, and calling for many of us listeners and viewers to actually join in the fight. Again, if you need information, check out the Asian Hall of Fame website. I will be putting all of this information below wherever it is that you're watching this or listening to this, so that you can have all the links and learn more about how you can participate. Thank you again. I'm Silva Harapetian. See you next time.